So, Putin looks weaker and weaker and weaker. And it starts to look inevitable that something has to be done if Putin's not to look like he's completely lost control.
The plane crash, was it crashed? Was it blown up? Was it shot down? And what the death of the head of the Wagner Group means, big picture, Matthew.
What does it mean? It means, it's really spectacular, isn't it? It's quite something. I mean, this is a rule which has always been built on the threat of violence. Going back to Putin's early days and threatening to wipe out Chechen terrorists, and some really dreadful assassinations of journalists and politicians, people like Boris Nemtsov. But really, there's brilliant analysis by a guy called Mark Galeotti, who's a really brilliant Russia analyst in The Spectator this morning, where he argues that this really is a new era of assassination and sort of really spectacular assassination of somebody who's, the nature of Putin's rule was that he was always, for a long time, able to manage these sort of disputes, these internal factions, through the combination of corruption, electoral fraud, and so on. And what Prigozhin's mutiny showed was that his ability to manage those disputes was falling apart under the pressures of the war. And so this does look like a really quite spectacular attempt, if it indeed is an assassination, to reimpose that discipline through brutal and spectacular and public violence. I mean, Galeotti's argument is that ultimately this exposes the weaknesses in Putin's regime, and that some of the elites will be now wondering, actually, are they still safe and better off sticking close to Putin? I mean, the big picture is, let's put this in context. This is all a result of the war in Ukraine. This was a war launched by Vladimir Putin. It appears in the belief that it would cement his place in history as a great Russian leader and create this perverse idea of this greater Russia, and that the Ukrainian state would disintegrate on contact. It would fall apart within days, and they'd install a puppet regime. Now, what's happened? The Ukrainian nation has never looked more sort of vital and alive idea. There's been a phenomenal coalescing around the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky, and it is Russia which has been thrown into chaos. We're seeing these rival factions, doubts about Putin's longevity. I mean, it is a warning from history, isn't it, about what happens if you go to war against if you go to war against your neighbours and the chaos you sow within your own system.
It's also what it just tells us about Putin's judgment and grip, Manveen. This didn't happen immediately after the coup. In fact, there was this sort of weird business where they sort of seemed to kiss and make up, and they were going to rub along nicely, and he was just going to go off and retire somewhere. For some reason, Putin suddenly decided, right, no, he's got to go now. And it just suggests, again, his sharpness, his grip, his control isn't what it was.
I think everyone's sort of expected this to happen for a while, from the moment that there was an attempted coup, from the moment, to be honest, even before that, when Prigozhin started quite openly insulting Putin and saying that he wasn't very effective anymore in his videos from the battlefield and looking like he was the one really running the war. You knew that couldn't go on for very long. And then you had the attempted coup. You had Putin sort of saying this was treachery, betrayal, and if there's one thing he can't put up with, it's exactly that. So it was only a matter of time, but we had this weird period in the middle. If you think back to a similar circumstance in Turkey when they had an attempted coup, Erdogan immediately, within 24 hours, had locked up anyone who could have had anything to do with the coup. And weirdly, having almost lost power, having almost had a coup against him, came out looking stronger than ever, looking absolutely unassailable. And with Putin, you sort of had this mad circumstance where Russians were killed during this attempted coup, and yet everybody who was involved in it was allowed to walk away scot-free. There was no punishment for them at all. Prigozhin went to Belarus, and then we found out very quickly, came back and had a 3-hour meeting in the Kremlin, during which he was, Putin very publicly said this. He sort of said he had demanded that there was a change of leadership in Wagner, and they didn't listen. So, Putin looks weaker and weaker and weaker. And it starts to look inevitable that something has to be done if Putin's not to look like he's completely lost control. And we've had a series of just 2 days ago, Prigozhin put out yet another video. He's on the ground in Africa on the very day that Putin is addressing the BRICS summit in South Africa, but he can't do it in South Africa because there's an arrest warrant for him from the International Criminal Court. So he's having to do it by a video link, looking quite weak. And there's Prigozhin looking vital and on the ground, and he's the one who is doing what Putin can't. So, there was a lot of, Prigozhin really was pushing it. There was a lot of sort of a red flag to a bull in the last few weeks. So it did feel like it was only a matter of time, but it's still spectacular that it's happened. And I'm not sure Putin looks as strong as he had hoped at the end of it.
Practical terms, Matthew, in terms of executing the war in Ukraine, the Wagner Group under Prigozhin was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. In fact, the whole point of the coup was him to say, look, we're not getting the support that we need. We're not getting the equipment. We're not making the progress and the gains that we should be making in Ukraine. So if you remove him and presumably now the Wagner Group from that war effort, given that they've just lost their leader, that actually makes the ultimate aim of taking back Ukraine even harder, doesn't it?
It raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? We shouldn't underplay just what a vile group this was. This was a group that became notorious for sort of. So Wagner Group is effectively a mercenary group that was used to do a lot of the Kremlin's dirty work. So in Central African Republic and Syria, and originally raised to fight, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Became absolutely notorious for war crimes. Effectively, became notorious for the use of sledgehammers to kill people, to kill prisoners, including in Ukraine, linked to beheadings, all sorts of ghastly things that Prigozhin revelled in, and it became a bit of he became a bit of a folk hero, actually, and had some support in Russia amongst this sort of nationalist faction that think the war should be prosecuted more aggressively, that think that they're fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and this is the sort of the faction that Putin has to manage now, who actually regard Prigozhin as a hero. There were messages sent out on their Telegram channel saying that we will avenge this, and this is a terrible mistake.
And so if anything, he's just fighting on another front.